I signed up for a clinical trial on the dark web. They didn't tell me it would change my DNA. It's kind of embarrassing to admit, but this whole thing started because I was broke. Like, really broke. I had student loans, credit card bills, rent that was 3 months overdue. Things were spiraling fast. You know that moment when you're constantly dodging calls because you're afraid it's a collector? Yeah, that was my life, and it was hell. I'd heard about making easy money on the dark web before. People joke about it, right? Like, oh, just sell a kidney. Or, why don't you check the dark web for some quick cash? It's one of those things that floats around in your head, but never becomes an actual plan until you're desperate. One night, I couldn't sleep. Anxiety was gnawing at me, and I was sitting at my desk, the glow of my laptop the only light in the room. I don't even remember how I got there, but I ended up on a dark web forum. I was just curious at first, scrolling through the shady posts. Most of it was either too sketchy or outright dangerous. I wasn't looking to sell body parts, or worse. I just needed something low risk, quick, and anonymous. That's when I found it. Buried under threads about buying counterfeit passports and stolen credit card numbers was a post that caught my eye. It was titled, "Willing to make $20,000 fast. Participate in an anonymous clinical trial, 20 grand." My pulse quickened. I thought it was a scam at first, but the post was surprisingly well written, almost professional. It claimed to be run by a reputable underground pharmaceutical company testing a new drug that hadn't hit the market yet. They were looking for healthy adults to participate in a 3-week trial. No names, no background checks. Just show up, follow the instructions, and walk away with $20,000. It seemed too easy. But when you're staring down a stack of bills and eviction notices, easy starts to look real good. There was a link at the bottom of the post. I clicked it, half expecting some phishing attempt or a virus to fry my computer. Instead, it took me to a surprisingly clean-looking website. It had this sterile, almost hospital-like design, and everything was in black and white. There was a single form: age, gender, general health, and availability. I filled it out without thinking too much about it. And then I waited. I kind of expected nothing to happen. You know, like when you throw your name into some sketchy lottery and it never pans out. But about an hour later, I got an email from a weird, randomized address. It didn't say much, just an acceptance notice with a time and place for orientation. I was supposed to meet at an old, run-down warehouse in the industrial part of town. It felt wrong, all of it. But again, $20,000. I convinced myself it was just an unlicensed drug test. The worst that could happen was some weird side effects, right? I showed up 2 days later. When I got there, the warehouse looked even more run down than I'd expected. The windows were blacked out, and the parking lot was empty except for one sleek black SUV that seemed way too nice for this part of town. I hesitated at the entrance, wondering if this was all some elaborate setup for a robbery or worse. But before I could turn back, a guy stepped out of the SUV. He was tall, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, with a clean-shaven face that didn't match the grimy surroundings. He smiled at me, but there was something off about it. It didn't reach his eyes. "You're here for the trial?" he asked, his voice clipped, professional. I nodded, my stomach in knots. He gestured for me to follow him inside, and I did, against every instinct screaming at me to run. The inside was as sketchy as the outside. It looked like a mix between an abandoned office and a makeshift lab. The walls were peeling, and the fluorescent lights flickered overhead. But then there were these rows of pristine medical equipment that looked like it had been flown in from the future. A woman in a white lab coat was already waiting for us. She had this cold, clinical look about her, sharp features, no nonsense. She barely glanced at me as she handed me a clipboard with a contract. "Standard procedure," she said flatly. "Just sign at the bottom. Once you're in, there's no backing out." I skimmed the contract, barely. It was dense, filled with medical jargon and terms I didn't understand. But at the bottom, in plain English, it said, $20,000 will be transferred to your account upon completion of the trial. And in that moment, that's all I cared about. I scribbled my signature. What happened next was a blur. I remember being led to a small, windowless room with a single metal chair. They strapped me in, which should have been a huge red flag, but I'd already committed. The woman, who still hadn't given me her name, inserted an IV into my arm. "You'll feel a pinch," she said, and then everything went black. I woke up in my own bed the next morning, with no memory of how I got there. There was no sign of the warehouse or the people, but when I checked my phone, there was a new message. Day 1. Side effects expected. Report back tomorrow at the same time. That's when I noticed something strange. My skin, on my arm where the IV had been inserted, it wasn't normal. The veins were darker, almost black. And there was this faint, pulsing sensation, like something was moving underneath. I tried to brush it off. It was probably just a reaction to the drug, right? I mean, that's what clinical trials are for. They're supposed to test for weird side effects. But as the day went on, the pulsing got worse. By the time the sun set, it wasn't just my arm. My entire body felt like it was changing. And this was only the first day. I spent most of that night sitting on my bed, staring at my arm. I kept telling myself it was fine. Probably just the drug working its way through my system, right? But that black pulsing vein wasn't fading. If anything, it was getting darker, like the ink was spreading under my skin. By the time midnight rolled around, the pulsing wasn't the worst part anymore. My body was aching all over, like I had the flu, only 10 times worse. It felt like my muscles were stretching and tightening, almost like they didn't fit under my skin anymore. It wasn't pain exactly, more like a deep, unsettling pressure that wouldn't stop. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion, because I woke up the next morning, drenched in sweat, my sheets twisted around me. The first thing I did was check my phone. Another message was waiting for me. Day 2. Continue as normal. Expect further symptoms. I stared at it, my brain struggling to process what further symptoms meant. Wasn't this bad enough? I thought about going back to that warehouse, demanding answers. But part of me was too freaked out to return. I couldn't face that woman again, not after seeing what this was doing to me. But when I tried to stand up, my legs gave out beneath me. My knees buckled like they couldn't hold my weight anymore, and I collapsed onto the floor. The room spun, my vision blurring, and for a second I thought I was going to black out again. Then, I saw my reflection in the mirror. It wasn't a big change at first, just subtle enough that I could almost convince myself I was imagining it. My skin had taken on this weird, grayish tint, like I was sick or hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. But the real problem? My eyes. The whites weren't white anymore. They darkened, turning this eerie, almost yellowish color, with veins creeping out from the edges, just like the ones on my arm. I stumbled back, panic rising in my chest. My mind raced through a million possibilities, but none of them made sense. No drug trial was supposed to do this. I called the number from the email. It rang twice before a familiar voice answered, the woman from the lab. "I need to speak to someone," I said, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. This This isn't normal. Side effects are expected, she said coolly. It will pass. What do you mean it'll pass? My eyes, my skin. Something's wrong. Her voice didn't change. You signed the contract. You were informed that reactions to the treatment would occur. There is nothing to worry about. That was it. No explanation, no offer to bring me in and check things out. Just a brush off like this was all part of the plan. I hung up, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. Go to the hospital? What was I going to tell them? That I signed up for an unlicensed clinical trial on the dark web and now my body was mutating? No way. The day dragged on. I kept myself locked in my apartment, barely eating, barely moving. Every time I checked the mirror, something else had changed. My skin wasn't just gray anymore. It was taking on this weird, almost translucent quality. I could see the veins underneath, thick and black, crawling up my arms, across my chest, down my legs, and the pulsing, the thing, under my skin was getting stronger. I could feel it shifting, like something was alive in there, pushing against the muscle and bone. By nightfall, my body wasn't just aching, it was burning. I could barely move without feeling like my joints were grinding against each other. And my face, I didn't even recognize it anymore. The eyes staring back at me from the bathroom mirror were completely yellow now, glowing faintly in the dark like a cat's. My skin had stretched so thin over my bones that I could make out the shape of my skull beneath it. I thought about going to the emergency room, but what would I say? They'd think I was on drugs or having some kind of psychotic break. No one would believe this was happening because I could hardly believe it myself. I tried to sleep that night, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, the pulsing under my skin got worse, like something was struggling to get out. I couldn't shake the feeling that my body wasn't mine anymore, that whatever they'd injected me with was taking over. Around 3 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. The pressure, the burning, it felt like I was going to explode. I stumbled into the bathroom, gripping the sink to keep myself upright, and looked in the mirror one last time. That's when I saw it. The skin on my arm. It was splitting. Tiny cracks were forming along the veins, like my skin was being torn apart from the inside, and something dark, something wet, was seeping through the cracks. I screamed. I don't know how long I stood there staring at my arm, but the longer I looked, the clearer it became that whatever this was, it wasn't me anymore. My body was turning into something else, something inhuman. I couldn't explain it, but I knew, deep down, that this wasn't just some experimental drug. They had lied to me. The message that morning had been clear. Expect further symptoms. But they hadn't told me what those symptoms really were, because this wasn't a clinical trial. It was something much worse. I don't remember falling asleep that night. It was more like my body just shut down from the pain and exhaustion. When I woke up, the room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone screen on the floor. My head was pounding, and for a second, I forgot where I was, or what was happening to me. Then I looked down at my arm. The skin was still cracked, but it had stopped bleeding. Instead, a thick, dark substance was oozing from the open wounds. It wasn't blood. It was like tar, sticky, black, and reeking of something foul, like decay. I gagged and scrambled to the bathroom, flipping on the light with shaky hands. The reflection that greeted me was beyond horrifying. My face, it didn't even look human anymore. The skin was tight, pulled back so much that I could see the shape of my skull underneath. My cheekbones were too sharp, too defined, almost like they were pushing outward, and my eyes, those yellow glowing eyes, were sunken deep into their sockets, surrounded by dark circles. I looked like a corpse that had been pulled out of a swamp, but the worst part wasn't my face, it was my chest. I peeled my shirt off, my hands trembling, and saw that the same cracks had spread across my torso. They snaked from my neck down to my abdomen, like fissures in a crumbling statue. But it wasn't just the cracks. There was something moving underneath the skin. Something shifting. I pressed my hand against my chest, and I felt it. Something alive, writhing just beneath the surface. It wasn't my heartbeat. No, this was different. Faster. Like a swarm of insects, all trapped inside me, trying to break free. Panic set in. I had to get help. I didn't care if I sounded crazy. I didn't care if they locked me up in some psych ward. I couldn't deal with this alone anymore. I grabbed my phone, fingers slick with sweat, and dialed 911. The line rang. Once, twice. Then a voice answered, calm, automated. We're sorry, but your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please, try again later. I stared at the phone in disbelief. I dialed again. Same message. Again. Every time, the same dead response. No signal, no connection, nothing. It was like someone had cut me off entirely from the outside world. That's when the realization hit me. They didn't want me to get help. This whole thing, it was a trap. They weren't just testing some new drug. They were doing something to me, something far worse than I had imagined. And now, they were making sure I couldn't escape. I tried to calm down, but the fear was too much. My mind was racing, desperate for answers. I thought about going back to the warehouse, but every instinct I had screamed that I shouldn't. If they'd done this to me, what would they do if I showed up looking like this? Then I heard it. A faint tapping sound. It was coming from the hallway just outside my apartment. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze, listening. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like someone or something was pacing back and forth just beyond my door. I crept to the door, every muscle in my body tense, and pressed my ear against the wood. The sound stopped. Complete silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, barely breathing. Then there was a knock. Just one. Software almost polite. I backed away from the door, heart hammering in my chest. Whoever or whatever was out there, I wasn't opening that door. Not a chance. The knock came again, this time louder, more forceful. I scrambled backward, knocking over a lamp, the crash echoing through the room. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely keep my grip on the lamp as I picked it up and held it in front of me, like it was some kind of pathetic weapon. The knocking stopped. Silence again. I waited, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Nothing. No sound. No movement. I thought maybe, whoever it was had left. I was about to lower the lamp when I heard the door handle turn. Slowly. Deliberately. I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall. The handle rattled for a moment, then clicked as it unlocked. I hadn't locked it. In my panic, I hadn't thought to lock it. The door swung open just a crack, enough for me to see the hallway outside. It was empty. No one was there. For a moment, I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I couldn't comprehend what was happening. Then, very slowly, I stepped toward the door. I had to know. I had to see what had opened it. I pushed the door open, peering into the dimly lit hallway. It was completely deserted. No signs of life, no sounds, nothing. But then I saw it. Just outside my door, on the floor, was a small silver syringe. I picked it up carefully, my heart racing. It was filled with a clear liquid. There was a note attached to it. A small piece of paper folded neatly under the syringe. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note had just one word written on it. Inject. I stared at the note for what felt like hours. Inject. Just one word, written in small, neat handwriting, like whoever left it had all the time in the world. My mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it. Someone had been here, someone who knew what was happening to me, and they were telling me to inject this thing. The syringe felt cold and heavy in my hand. I held it up to the light, watching the clear liquid slosh inside. It didn't look like much, but my gut twisted with a deep sense of dread. Whatever was in that syringe, I wasn't sure it would help. And after everything that had already happened, could I really trust this? My body disagreed. The pulsing under my skin had gotten worse, more intense. The dark veins were spreading faster now, creeping across my chest and up my neck. I could feel it moving under my skin, like something was burrowing through me, changing me from the inside out. I looked at the syringe again. My breath was shallow, panic clawing at the edges of my mind. It was either this, or letting whatever was happening to me continue. I sat down on the floor, my back against the wall, staring at the syringe as if it held all the answers. My arm was trembling so badly that I wasn't sure I could even hold it steady enough to inject myself. I didn't want to. I didn't trust it. But the alternative was losing myself completely. I had no other choice. With shaking hands, I rolled up my sleeve and exposed the skin of my forearm. The veins there were dark, throbbing, almost alive under the surface. I closed my eyes and pressed the needle into my skin, wincing as it punctured the surface. Slowly, I pushed the plunger down, the liquid entering my bloodstream. At first, nothing happened. I sat there, the empty syringe still in my hand, waiting for something, anything, to change. And for a few moments, everything was still, almost peaceful. Then the pain hit. It was like my blood had turned to acid. It started in my arm where the injection had been, but it spread fast, burning through my veins like fire. I screamed and dropped the syringe, clutching my arm as the pain shot through my entire body. My muscles seized, locking up as I convulsed on the floor, every nerve screaming in agony. I thought I was going to die, but then, just as suddenly as it had started, the pain stopped. I lay there on the floor, panting, drenched in sweat. My heart was racing, but the burning was gone, the pulsing under my skin. It had stopped. I sat up slowly, my body trembling from the aftershocks of the pain. My arm, where the veins had been dark and swollen, was now normal. The blackness was gone. The cracks in my skin had sealed themselves, leaving only faint scars behind. I stared at my arm in disbelief. It had worked. Whatever was in that syringe, it had stopped the transformation. I was still me, or so I thought. Relief washed over me. I didn't care who had left the syringe or why. It didn't matter anymore. The nightmare was over. I could breathe again, think again. My mind was clearing, no longer clouded by pain and fear. But as I stood up, I noticed something. The mirror. At first glance, I looked normal again. My skin had regained its color, the veins no longer dark and bulging. But there was something off. I stepped closer, peering into the mirror, and that's when I saw it. My eyes, they weren't glowing anymore, but the irises had changed. They were darker now, almost black, with a faint, barely noticeable shimmer. And then, I felt it again. A slight twitch in my chest, like something deep inside me had moved. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. My heart skipped a beat, and I pressed my hand against my chest, feeling for that familiar pulsing sensation. Nothing. For a moment, I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the pain and terror had messed with my mind. But as I stood there, staring at myself in the mirror, I realized something horrifying. The thing inside me, it hadn't stopped. It had just gone deeper. I could still feel it, faint but unmistakable, like something had burrowed further into my body, hiding just beneath the surface, waiting. I stumbled backward, my mind racing. The syringe had stopped the visible changes, but it hadn't fixed me. Whatever had been growing inside me, it was still there. I wasn't cured. And then the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't at the door. It was coming from inside the walls. A rhythmic, steady tapping, like something was crawling through the space between the drywall and the studs. I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, like whatever it was knew I was listening. My eyes darted around the room, trying to pinpoint the sound, but it was everywhere, surrounding me. Then I saw it. The wall to my left, it wasn't just the noise. There was something moving in the wall, a faint bulge, pushing outward, as if something was pressing against the surface, trying to break through. My stomach churned with nausea. I ran to the door, yanking it open, and sprinted out into the hallway. I didn't care what was out there. I needed to get out, away from whatever that thing was. But as I reached the stairwell, my phone buzzed. A message. I froze, dread filling my veins as I pulled the phone from my pocket. The screen lit up with a new notification. Day 3. Return to the warehouse. You are not done yet. I stared at the message, my hands shaking. They still had me. I wasn't free. And whatever they'd put inside me, it wasn't done growing. I stood in the hallway, staring at my phone like it had grown teeth. My breathing was shallow, heart pounding in my ears. They wanted me back at the warehouse. After everything they'd done, after this, they wanted me to come back. I should have run. I should have smashed the phone, grabbed whatever I could carry and disappeared. But I didn't, because deep down, I knew there was no running. Whatever they'd done to me, it was still inside, still waiting. And the truth was, I needed answers. I needed to know what they'd put in me, what I was becoming. So, I went back. The drive to the warehouse felt like it took years, even though it was only across town. The streets were empty, eerily quiet, like the world had forgotten I existed. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, my hands were slick with sweat, and my body was shaking with nervous energy. The warehouse was just as grim as before, abandoned, with those blacked-out windows that now seemed even more menacing. The same black SUV was parked in front. I parked a few spaces away and sat there for a minute, trying to steady my breathing. My phone buzzed again. Another message. Enter. Time is running out. I swallowed the lump in my throat and stepped out of the car. Every step toward the warehouse felt like walking into my own grave. When I reached the door, it creaked open before I could even touch it. The same suited man from before was waiting inside, his face expressionless, eyes cold. This way, he said, turning and walking deeper into the building. I followed him, my body moving on autopilot. The corridors were darker than I remembered, the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. The air was thick, heavy, with the scent of disinfectant and something metallic. Blood, maybe. My skin crawled as I felt those invisible eyes on me again, like the building itself was watching. He led me down a staircase, deeper into the bowels of the warehouse. The deeper we went, the colder the air got. My breath came out in shallow clouds, and my fingers started to go numb. Finally, we reached a heavy metal door at the bottom of the stairs. The man opened it, gesturing for me to step inside. I hesitated for a second, but I had come this far. What choice did I have? Inside was a room that looked nothing like the warehouse above. It was clinical, cold, like the inside of a hospital or a lab. Bright, blinding lights illuminated every inch of the space, reflecting off the sleek white walls. And in the center of the room, there was a metal table. Strapped to that table was a body. My stomach lurched when I saw it. The body was mine. At least, it looked like me. My face, my hair, my body, lying there motionless, hooked up to all kinds of tubes and machines. My mind rebelled at the sight. This had to be some kind of sick trick, right? But as I stepped closer, I could see the tiny movements, the rise and fall of the chest, the faint flicker of life behind the closed eyes. What? What the hell is this? I whispered, backing away in horror. That is you, a voice said behind me. I spun around to see the woman from before, the one who'd inserted the IV on the first day. She stood in the doorway, her cold eyes watching me with a kind of detached curiosity, like I was an experiment under a microscope. No, I stammered. That can't be me. I'm here. I'm standing right here. She tilted her head, like I'd said something amusing. What you are, she said slowly, is not what you think. I shook my head, my mind reeling. You drugged me. You did something to me. What did you put inside me? She smiled, a small, cruel smile. It's not about what we put inside you. It's about what we took out. My blood ran cold. The human body is remarkable, she continued, stepping closer to the table, her gaze shifting between me and the body. But it's limited. You signed up for a trial, yes, but it wasn't a drug trial. We've been perfecting a process, one that allows us to separate a consciousness from its organic host. I staggered back, my heart racing. What are you talking about? You've been living in a shell, she said, her voice soft, almost soothing. An artificial construct. Your mind, your thoughts. They were all transferred into this shell while we worked on perfecting your real body. She gestured to the body on the table, my body. I shook my head violently, refusing to believe it. That's not possible. I'm me. Not anymore, she said coldly. The process wasn't perfect. The shell, your new body, wasn't ready for full integration. That's why you've been experiencing those side effects. It's breaking down. But don't worry. We can fix this. We just need to transfer you back. I stumbled back toward the door, panic clawing at my throat. Number. No, you're lying. I'm not something you created. You signed the contract, she reminded me. You agreed to the terms. You're part of the experiment now. I turned and bolted for the door, but the man in the suit was there, blocking my path, his expression blank, unreadable. I turned to the woman again, my mind racing. Why? Why are you doing this? She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto mine. Because we're preparing for something bigger. The human race, our bodies, they're obsolete. We're building something better, something stronger. And you, she pointed at me, are one of the first. I felt sick, my stomach churning with fear and disgust. You can't do this. It's already done. The lights above me flickered and suddenly I felt it, the pulsing, the shifting under my skin, stronger than ever. My body convulsed, the black veins spreading again, the thing inside me trying to break free. I collapsed to the floor, my vision blurring as I tried to hold myself together. But I could feel it. I was falling apart. My body wasn't holding anymore. It was unraveling, piece by piece. I looked up at the woman, tears of pain and terror streaming down my face. Please, stop this. But her face was cold, emotionless. It's too late. The last thing I saw before everything went black was the body on the table, my body, stirring, its eyes fluttering open. And then the darkness swallowed me whole. That's when I realized I was never getting out. Not in this body, not in any. They had taken everything from me. And now I was just another part of the experiment. I was hired on the dark web to clean a medical lab after hours. What I found in the basement made me quit. You know how they say curiosity killed the cat? Yeah, I thought that was just some cliche adults told kids to keep them out of trouble. Turns out, there's a lot of truth in it. I'm not dead or anything, but I really wish I'd listened to my gut on this one. It all started a few months ago, during a rough patch when I was struggling to make ends meet. Rent was overdue, my fridge was a joke, and I was barely holding on to my crappy day job. One late night, after going down a rabbit hole of Reddit conspiracy theories and YouTube documentaries, I found myself in a place I swore I'd never go. The deep web. Now, before you roll your eyes and say, another dark web horror story, hear me out. I wasn't looking for anything illegal, just desperate for a way to make some quick cash. And that's when I stumbled upon it. It was a job posting buried deep on one of those sketchy forums. No fancy title or flashy description, just a simple message. Nighttime cleaner. Wanted for medical lab. No questions asked. Good pay. I know. It sounds shady as hell. But when you're broke, anything that says good pay catches your attention. Besides, it wasn't like I had to do anything illegal, right? Cleaning's cleaning. How bad could it be? The instructions were weird, though. There was no company name, no address, just a contact link that took me to a chat. The person on the other end, using the name Admin78, gave me minimal details. The job was for a medical research facility on the outskirts of town, and the pay? $2,000 a night. That was more than I made in a month at my regular job. They said the place was locked after hours, and no one would be around, so I wouldn't have to interact with anyone. I should have walked away, but $2,000 for a few hours of cleaning? My desperation overpowered my common sense. Admin 78 didn't ask for a resume, references, or any personal info. Just told me to show up at 11 p.m., clean the main lab and offices, and, this part stuck out, stay out of the basement. At first, I figured it was just storage or something. I accepted the job, and a few minutes later, I got a message with a location. It was just an address, no building name, no instructions about where to park, nothing. It was the kind of message that made my skin crawl just reading it, but I was too deep in at that point. The night of my first shift, I pulled up to the address, and it looked exactly like what you'd expect. An old, run-down medical facility surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. I couldn't even tell if the place was still operational. The windows were dark, and the only sign of life was a single flickering streetlight outside the entrance. I texted admin 78 as instructed when I arrived. Moments later, I got a reply. Doors open, alarms off. My stomach dropped, but I told myself it was fine. They'd probably just shut down operations for the night. I pushed the door open, and sure enough, the place was completely empty. The first thing that hit me was the smell. It wasn't your typical cleaning chemicals and antiseptic smell you'd expect in a medical lab. It was faint, almost like wet dirt. It clung to the air, making the whole place feel damp. The inside of the lab was eerily quiet, and as I walked down the hallway, my footsteps echoed off the linoleum floors. The building had that abandoned feel, like nobody had walked those halls in years. But what really got me was how cold it was. Not just turn the thermostat down cold. but the kind that makes you want to wrap up in a blanket and never leave. I chalked it up to an overactive AC system, but still, something about it didn't sit right with me. I started with the main office. It wasn't anything special, just a few desks, some computers that looked older than me, and filing cabinets filled with medical reports. Nothing felt off yet, aside from the creepy atmosphere. It was a mindless routine, vacuuming, wiping down surfaces, taking out the trash, the kind of stuff I'd done 1,000 times before. But the longer I worked, the more unsettled I felt. It wasn't just the cold or the smell, it was the feeling of being watched. Every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, sure I'd seen something move out of the corner of my eye. Of course, nothing was ever there, just shadows playing tricks on me. I kept brushing it off, blaming it on the fact that I was alone in a creepy building late at night. Then I made the mistake of heading down a corridor I hadn't noticed before. At the end of it was a stairwell. And not just any stairwell. It led to the basement, the one place I was told to stay away from. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to see the darkness beyond. I stood there for a minute, debating. I was hired to clean, not snoop around, but curiosity got the better of me. Maybe they just had some old equipment down there. Nothing too weird, right? But why was it locked off? I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. And that's when I heard it. A noise. Soft, like a whimper. Faint enough that I couldn't be sure if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. But I swear it came from the basement. I froze. That soft whimper. It was enough to send a chill racing down my spine. I strained my ears, trying to hear it again, but the hallway had fallen dead silent. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe it was just the building settling, or some distant noise carried through the vents. Yeah, that had to be it, I told myself. The smart thing to do would have been to turn around, keep cleaning, and pretend I hadn't heard anything. But something about that sound, it wasn't just a random creak or groan of an old building. It was human, and it was suffering. Before I knew what I was doing, my feet were moving toward the door, the basement, the one place I was explicitly told to avoid. I know how stupid that sounds, but when you hear something that sounds like someone in pain, you don't just walk away. I pushed the door open a little further, peering down into the darkness below. The staircase was old, concrete steps with rusty railings. No lights were on down there, but there was just enough glow from the hallway behind me to see the first few steps. The air coming up from below was damp and heavy, carrying that same earthy, wet smell that had clung to the entire building, but stronger, more concentrated. It was the kind of smell that made you think of rot, decay, like something down there had been left to fester for far too long. I hesitated. My hand gripped the railing, and I had this overwhelming urge to just leave, to walk out of that place and never look back. But my curiosity was gnawing at me. What if someone was down there, hurt? What if they were trapped and nobody knew? I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the stairwell's cracked walls and a narrow hallway at the bottom. No sounds, no movement, just the oppressive silence pressing down on me. I took a deep breath and descended the stairs, my footsteps echoing with each hesitant step. When I reached the bottom, I realized just how cold it was down there. Not just cold, freezing, like someone had left the AC blasting, except there were no vents, no air circulation at all. The basement was a narrow corridor with several doors on each side, all of them closed. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but definitely not this. The doors were old, industrial looking, like they hadn't been used in years. But the walls, they were covered in something. At first, I thought it was just dirt, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was more like scratches, thin, jagged lines gouged into the concrete walls, as if someone or something had been clawing at them. My breath caught in my throat, and I swept the flashlight across the floor. There were dark stains leading from one of the doors, faint but unmistakable. I didn't need to be a crime scene investigator to know what they were. Blood. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, but my feet betrayed me, carrying me towards the door where the stains led. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. It felt cold, almost unnaturally so. I hesitated, every fiber of my being telling me this was a terrible idea, that whatever was behind this door was not something I wanted to see. But that soft whimper, it echoed in my head again, like a ghost of the noise I'd heard before. I pushed the door open. At first, the flashlight barely illuminated anything. The room beyond was massive, bigger than I expected, with high ceilings that disappeared into darkness. The beam of light flickered as it swept across the floor, revealing large steel tables, scattered equipment, and then it landed on something that made my blood run cold. A cage. A large, metal cage shoved against the far wall. Inside, something moved. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my ears. The flashlight trembled in my hand as I pointed it toward the cage, and I could see a figure huddled inside. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a large dog or something, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't. It was a person, barely human looking. Their skin was pale, almost translucent, stretched tight over bones that seemed wrong. Too long, too sharp, as if they had grown in ways they weren't supposed to. Their hair hung in matted clumps, and their eyes, God, their eyes. They were wide, staring right at me, but there was no life in them, no recognition, no emotion, just an empty, hollow stare. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. Was this some kind of experiment? Was this thing even alive? Then it moved. Its fingers, long and spindly, gripped the bars of the cage. The movement was slow, labored, as if it hadn't used its muscles in years. A low, guttural noise escaped its throat, not quite a groan, not quite a growl. It sounded like it was in pain, like it was trying to speak, but couldn't form the words. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. This wasn't right. None of this was right. Behind me, the door creaked. I spun around, shining the flashlight back toward the entrance. For a split second, I could have sworn I saw something moving in the shadows. Something large, hulking, just beyond the reach of the light. The floor creaked under the weight of whatever it was, and the stench in the air grew worse. That earthy, rotten smell was almost unbearable now, like death itself had crawled out of the walls. I backed up slowly, my heart racing, the flashlight shaking in my hand. Whatever was in that room with me, it wasn't human. I knew that much. I needed to get out. Now. But just as I reached the door, a deep, rasping voice echoed through the darkness. You shouldn't have come here. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. My body was frozen in place, every muscle locked up in pure, instinctual terror. The voice had come from somewhere deep in the room behind me, but it didn't sound right. It wasn't just raspy. It was distorted, like someone speaking through a broken ancient radio. Too low, too slow, like it was straining to mimic human speech, but hadn't quite mastered it. My flashlight flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard another creak. Something, or someone, was moving closer. The stench of rot filled the air so thick I could taste it. My throat tightened as bile rose, but I forced it down. If I threw up, I'd lose precious seconds. Seconds I didn't have. I took a shaky step forward, my back still to the room, desperate to make it out of the basement and back up those stairs. But before I could take another step, that voice came again. Closer this time. Leave. Now. Before it finds you. I whipped around, flashlight trembling in my grip. The figure in the cage hadn't moved. It was still gripping the bars, staring at me with those hollow eyes. But just beyond the cage, in the deep shadows, something else shifted. The beam of light flickered across the room, landing on a hand, or at least something that resembled a hand. It was too large, too deformed, the fingers long and twisted like gnarled tree branches. And it wasn't alone. There were more. Dozens of these things, these unnatural hands, reaching out from the darkness. They were attached to bodies, but the bodies were all wrong. Misshapen, hunched over, moving in a slow jerking motion, like marionettes being pulled by invisible strings. I couldn't make out their faces, just the dim glint of eyes that seemed to reflect the light unnaturally. They didn't blink. They didn't look away. They were watching me. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out everything else. I backed away, my feet slipping on the cold, damp floor. One of the creatures took a step forward, its movements erratic, like it wasn't used to walking upright. I forced myself to move, to run, but before I could make it to the door, something else happened. The air around me seemed to change. It grew heavier, colder, impossibly cold. And then I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of something brushing against my back. I spun around, swinging the flashlight wildly, but there was nothing there. Just empty space and the sound of my ragged breathing. But I could still feel it, like invisible hands, hovering just inches away from my skin, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The voice came again, but this time it wasn't from the room behind me. It was in my ear. Run! I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted. My feet barely touched the ground as I tore through the corridor, racing toward the stairs. I didn't care about the noise I was making anymore. Whatever those things were, they weren't normal, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what they wanted. I hit the stairs at full speed, my legs burning as I sprinted up, 2 steps at a time. Behind me, I heard the scraping of claws on concrete. The sound was unmistakable. Something was chasing me, something fast. I could hear its ragged breathing, like it was right on my heels. I pushed myself harder, my lungs screaming for air. But the top of the stairs seemed impossibly far away. Just as I reached the last few steps, I felt it again. That invisible presence, like icy fingers brushing the back of my neck. I gasped, stumbling forward and slamming into the door at the top. My hands fumbled for the handle, but it wouldn't turn. My heart dropped into my stomach. The door was locked. No, 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 I muttered under my breath, my fingers shaking as I frantically twisted the knob. The creature's footsteps were growing louder, closer, the scraping echoing through the stairwell. In a panic, I threw my shoulder against the door, praying it would give way. And then, just as the sound reached the bottom of the stairs, the door clicked open. I tumbled out into the hallway, slamming the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps as I pressed my back against the wood, my eyes fixed on the crack at the bottom of the door. For a few seconds, there was nothing. No sound, no movement, just silence. And then the shadows under the door shifted. Something was down there, standing just on the other side. I held my breath. A low, guttural growl echoed from the other side of the door, followed by the faintest sound of nails dragging across the wood. But whatever it was, it didn't try to force its way in. It just waited, watching, listening. I didn't move. I couldn't. All I could do was pray that the door would hold, that whatever was on the other side couldn't get through. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity. Slowly the noises faded. The growling stopped, and the dragging sound disappeared down the stairs. But I wasn't about to stick around to see if it would come back. I scrambled to my feet, my body still trembling, and bolted for the exit. The hallway seemed longer than it had before, the fluorescent lights above flickering ominously as I ran. Every shadow felt alive, every corner a potential hiding spot for something waiting to grab me. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. I burst through the front door, gasping for air as I stumbled outside. The cold night air hit my face like a slap, but it felt like freedom. I glanced back at the building, just a dark, silent structure, no signs of life. From the outside, it looked like any ordinary lab, but I knew better now. Whatever was down in that basement, it wasn't human. It wasn't even close. And as I stood there catching my breath, I realized something that made my blood run cold all over again. I hadn't finished cleaning. I still had the keys to the building, and I still had the rest of the week to work. But after what I'd just seen, there was no way in hell I was going back. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I didn't even make it back to my apartment. Instead, I drove around aimlessly for hours, my mind replaying what had just happened in that basement. No matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was just some freak hallucination, the truth gnawed at me. That thing, the things I saw down there weren't just some figment of my imagination. I eventually parked at a 24-hour diner, the kind that never judges anyone for sitting in a booth at 4 a.m. I ordered coffee. I didn't drink, and just stared out the window, watching the darkness as if something might crawl out of it at any moment. My phone buzzed a couple of times. Messages from admin 78. Did you finish the job? Report your hours. I didn't reply. I couldn't. I wasn't going to touch that place again. But what really freaked me out was that there wasn't a single mention of what I'd seen. No warning about the basement or acknowledgement of anything out of the ordinary. Like they didn't even care. Maybe they expected me to go snooping. Maybe they wanted me to. Hours passed. The sun came up, but it didn't bring any comfort. The whole world felt off, like I was in some dream I couldn't wake up from. I knew I had to make a decision. Do I go back and pretend nothing happened? Do I ghost them, change my number, and hope they never track me down? The answer seemed obvious, until I got home. I pulled into my parking lot, tired, but sure I was done with this nightmare. But as soon as I stepped out of the car, I felt it again. That creeping sensation, like icy fingers brushing the back of my neck. The same feeling I'd had in the basement. My head snapped around, scanning the street. Nothing. No movement, no signs of anything out of the ordinary. But the air felt wrong, heavy. It was like that cold, oppressive atmosphere from the lab had followed me home. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Lack of sleep, stress, whatever. I just needed to crash and forget all this ever happened. I headed inside, locked the door behind me, and tried to relax. But the second I stepped into my apartment, I froze. Something was off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. Everything looked normal, but there was this feeling, like someone or something had been here. The air felt stale, almost like I'd walked into a room that had been sealed off for years. My heart started racing, and I found myself instinctively reaching for the baseball bat I kept by the door. I moved through my apartment slowly, checking every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing, everything was exactly where I'd left it, but the unease wouldn't go away. That same coldness I felt in the basement was here, lurking in every shadow, clinging to the corners of every room. Then I heard it, a faint scraping sound coming from the hallway just outside my door. I froze, gripping the bat tightly, my knuckles turning white. The sound was unmistakable, slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across wood. It only lasted a few seconds, then stopped. Silence. I stood there, bat in hand, listening to my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I wanted to convince myself it was just some random noise, a neighbor or something. But deep down, I knew better. I knew that sound. I'd heard it before. I crept toward the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the peephole. I hesitated for a second, not sure if I really wanted to see what was on the other side, but I had to look. I had to know. I pressed my eye to the peephole and saw nothing, just the empty hallway, stretching out in both directions. No movement, no signs of life. But then, something shifted. At the very edge of the peephole's vision, just out of focus, I saw it. A shape, tall, gaunt, hunched over, standing just outside the view of the door. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I knew it was there, watching, waiting. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I slammed the deadbolt shut, then threw on the chain lock for good measure. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, and for a moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, waiting for something, anything. But nothing happened. Minutes passed, maybe even hours. I didn't know. The whole apartment felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in on me. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door. Just as my hand reached for the lock, the air in the room shifted again. Cold, heavy. I could feel it. Something was in the apartment with me. I turned around slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. And that's when I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near my bedroom door, stood the same figure I'd seen outside the basement door. Tall, emaciated, its skin pale and stretched taut over its bones. But this time, it was closer, much closer. Its eyes, those hollow, lifeless eyes, were locked onto me, unblinking, like it was studying me. It didn't move, just stood there, breathing slow and heavy, a sound like air being sucked through rotting flesh. My body went numb with fear, and my mind screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was trapped, cornered in my own apartment. For what felt like an eternity, we just stood there, staring at each other. I couldn't look away. I didn't dare blink. Then, without warning, it turned its head ever so slightly, like it had heard something I couldn't. And then it spoke. Not in words, but in that same low, guttural growl I'd heard in the basement. Leave. I don't know what it meant by that. Leave the apartment? Leave the city? Leave this world? I wasn't about to ask. I bolted for the door, yanking it open and stumbling into the hallway. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the block, my lungs burning, my legs shaking. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Whatever that thing was, it had followed me, from the laboratory, from the basement, and now it knew where I lived. I don't know how long I ran, but by the time I stopped, my legs were about to give out, and my chest felt like it was on fire. I found myself on the outskirts of town, far from my apartment, far from that building. There was no plan, no destination in mind, just pure, animalistic fear, driving me away from whatever had followed me home. I collapsed on a bench in a rundown park, my breath ragged and my mind racing. What the hell was that thing? And why had it followed me? I kept trying to piece together some kind of explanation, but none of it made sense. Maybe it wasn't supposed to. The early morning light was starting to creep through the clouds, casting everything in a dull, grey hue. That eerie, suffocating cold had faded, but the feeling that something was wrong clung to me like a second skin. I couldn't shake it, no matter how far I ran. Then my phone buzzed. I pulled it out of my pocket, half expecting more messages from admin 78. But this time, it wasn't a text. It was a notification. One that shouldn't have been there. You have one missed call from an unknown number. My blood ran cold. I hadn't given my number to anyone on that job, not directly. I'd communicated through that anonymous chat, never shared any personal information. I stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity, my thumb hovering over the notification. I don't know why I did it. Maybe part of me was still searching for answers, for some kind of closure. But I tapped the notification and called the number back. The phone rang once, twice, and then nothing, just silence on the other end. I waited, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. And then, faintly, I heard it, that same scraping sound, nails on wood, slow and deliberate. It was faint, barely audible, but it was there. I hung up, my hands shaking. The thing was still with me. I didn't know how or why, but I couldn't escape it. No matter where I ran, no matter how far I tried to go, it was always there, lingering just out of sight, watching, waiting. I felt like a hunted animal, and there was no place I could hide. I knew I couldn't go back to my apartment. I couldn't go back to the lab. But what was I supposed to do? Sleep on the streets for the rest of my life? Leave town and hope it didn't follow me? Nothing felt like a real solution. I was trapped in some nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I was still sitting there, wrestling with my thoughts, when my phone buzzed again. Another notification. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a message from admin 78. We told you not to go in the basement. I stared at the screen, a sinking feeling of dread washing over me. They knew. Of course, they knew. They probably had cameras in the building, watching every move I made. Or maybe it wasn't cameras. Maybe they had something else watching me, something I couldn't see. The message continued. You've seen too much. The job is over. Don't come back. That last part should have felt like a relief, like I was off the hook, like I could just move on and forget any of this ever happened. But it didn't feel that way. There was something final about it, something ominous. I didn't reply. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I shoved the phone into my pocket and stood up, my legs still weak beneath me. I needed to keep moving. I didn't know where I was going, but staying in one place didn't feel like an option anymore. As I started walking, the cold returned. That same bone-chilling cold I'd felt in the basement. It wrapped itself around me like a fog, and I knew, without a doubt, that I wasn't alone. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see that gaunt figure lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing there, just the empty street, the grey sky, and the faint sound of the wind. But I could feel it. I could feel them, watching me. I kept walking, faster now, trying to stay ahead of the fear gnawing at my insides. But no matter how fast I moved, the feeling followed. It was like the darkness itself had come alive, wrapping around me like a living thing. And that's when I heard it again, the voice. You shouldn't have come here. It wasn't coming from behind me this time. It was coming from all around me. The air seemed to vibrate with the sound, deep and guttural, like the earth itself was speaking. My breath caught in my throat, and I started running, the fear swallowing me whole. But no matter how fast I ran, No matter how far I went, the voice stayed with me. Leave. I didn't stop running until I found myself back at my car, my chest heaving, my body shaking with exhaustion. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat there, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. I had to get out of the city, out of the state, if I had to. But as I turned the key in the ignition, my headlights flicked on, and I saw something that made my heart stop. Standing just at the edge of the parking lot, half hidden by the shadows, was the figure. The same one from the basement. Tall, gaunt, with those lifeless eyes fixed on me. It didn't move. It didn't need to, because now it had me. No matter where I went, no matter how far I tried to run, it would follow. And as I sat there, staring at it through the windshield, I realized something. This wasn't just about the basement. It wasn't just about the job. Whatever was down there, whatever I'd stumbled into, wasn't going to let me go. I had opened a door that couldn't be closed. I signed up for a paid study on the dark web. I haven't seen daylight since. I know how this is going to sound, but you'll just have to bear with me. I wasn't desperate. I wasn't out of options or anything. I guess I was just curious, and boredom can be a powerful motivator when life feels stagnant. About 3 months ago, I was in one of those funks where everything feels kind of meaningless. You know how it goes? Same job, same routine, no excitement. I found myself deep diving into random rabbit holes online just to pass the time. I've been down all the usual paths: conspiracy theories, unsolved mysteries, even a little dark web surfing. Now, before you jump to conclusions, no, I wasn't doing anything illegal. I'm just the kind of person who's fascinated by what most people shy away from. Anyway, one night while scrolling through yet another forum on some obscure site, I found a post buried deep in the comments. It wasn't anything fancy, just a simple link with a title that caught my eye. Paid study, $10,000 for 30 days, must have strong mind. 10 grand for a month? I thought it had to be some kind of scam, but the part that stood out to me was the must have a strong mind bit. I'm not going to lie, that weirdly piqued my interest. What kind of study required mental strength? I clicked the link without thinking too much about it, and a super minimalistic page popped up. Black background, white text. There was no company name, no logos, just a questionnaire. It asked questions about my mental health, my daily habits, my fears. I thought it was weirdly personal, but at that point, my curiosity had the best of me. I filled it out. After submitting, the screen stayed blank for a second, and I figured that was the end of it. Just some dead-end phishing attempt or whatever. I closed my laptop and went about my night, not thinking much of it. But the next morning, I got an email. The subject line just said, "You're in." It was from some generic-looking email address, and the body of the message was brief. "Congratulations. You have been selected to participate in our exclusive study. You will be compensated $10,000 for 30 days of your time. If you agree, reply with your confirmation, and further instructions will follow." At this point, I'm thinking, what's the worst that could happen? The email seemed legit, and honestly, 10 grand sounded pretty damn good. I had bills to pay, student loans still hanging over my head. It wasn't like I had a lot to lose. I replied, agreeing to the study. Within the hour, I got a response. "Thank you for your participation. You will be picked up tomorrow at 8 a.m. sharp. Please be ready. All necessary provisions will be provided. You are expected to remain at our facility for the duration of the study. No outside communication will be allowed." I thought that last part was strange, but again, it wasn't enough to scare me off. I figured it was just to ensure confidentiality or something, like they didn't want their study being compromised by outside influences. And besides, the thought of taking a month off from everything, no phone, no social media, actually sounded kind of appealing. So the next day, at exactly 8 a.m., this black SUV pulls up in front of my apartment. The windows were tinted so dark I couldn't see inside. A guy dressed in all black stepped out, looking like he was straight out of some spy movie or something. No words, no smile, just a quick nod in my direction as he opened the back door for me. As soon as I got in, the windows automatically tinted even darker. I couldn't see a thing outside, and there wasn't any conversation. The driver just sped off, and the next thing I knew, I was being driven down some long, winding roads, farther and farther away from civilization. After what felt like hours, we finally stopped. The driver didn't say a word, just gestured for me to get out. The air felt cooler, fresher, like we were in the mountains or some remote part of the country. I looked around, but there was nothing to see. Just trees and a single building looming in front of us. It wasn't what I expected. I thought I'd be going to some sterile, clinical-looking facility, but this place was more like an old mansion. The windows were blacked out, and the door looked ancient, like something out of an old Gothic novel. The only thing that seemed out of place was the high-tech security panel next to it. The guy knocked twice, and the door swung open. A woman stood there, dressed in a lab coat, her face partially obscured by the shadows inside. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "You've been chosen for something very special." Before I could ask anything, she stepped aside, motioning for me to come in. I hesitated, but eventually I crossed the threshold, and that's when things started to get weird. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt this heavy silence. You know how some places just feel wrong the moment you enter? Like the air is thick, and your instincts start firing off alarms. That's exactly what hit me the second the door closed behind me. There was no going back now. The interior of the place was odd. I expected some run-down, creepy mansion to match the exterior, but the inside was strangely clean. Too clean. The floors were polished wood, reflecting the dim lighting from these antique-looking chandeliers hanging overhead. There were no decorations, no pictures on the walls, just a few hallways branching off into different directions. It was sterile, in a way that didn't match the outside at all. The woman who greeted me, still in her lab coat, turned to face me. "I'm Dr. Quinn," she said, her voice as monotone as the atmosphere. "Follow me." She led me down one of the hallways. The floor creaked beneath my feet, and I swear, with every step, the place felt like it was watching me. I know how that sounds, but it was like there were eyes in the walls, hidden cameras or something. The feeling of being constantly observed was suffocating. We stopped in front of a heavy steel door at the end of the hall. It looked like it belonged in a bank vault, and that immediately set me on edge. What kind of study requires this level of security? Dr. Quinn pressed her hand against a panel next to the door, and with a series of loud clicks, it unlocked. The door swung open, revealing what could only be described as a high-tech cell. A bed, a desk, a chair, everything was bolted down. There were no windows, just a single fluorescent light buzzing overhead. My stomach sank. This wasn't the kind of facility I had imagined at all. "You'll be staying here, Doctor," Quinn said, as if this was the most normal thing in the world. "For the next 30 days, you'll remain in this room. Meals will be brought to you. There is a bathroom attached, and we've provided everything you'll need." I opened my mouth to ask her why this room looked more like a prison than a study, but before I could get a word out, she held up a hand. There are rules, she continued, her eyes fixed on mine. First, you are not to attempt to leave your room under any circumstances. The door will be locked, and it is for your safety. Second, you must consume everything we provide, every meal, every drink. Third, and most important, there is a camera in your room. She pointed to a small, barely noticeable black dot in the corner of the ceiling. It will be recording you at all times. Do not attempt to tamper with it. If you do, the study will be terminated and you will not be compensated. Her tone made it clear that this wasn't up for negotiation. I was to follow these rules or face the consequences. Before I could ask anything, she added one last thing. You may experience strange occurrences during your stay. This is expected and is part of the study. We need to observe how you handle certain stresses. What kind of stresses? I asked, my voice sounding shakier than I intended. She didn't answer, just gave me a cold smile and said, "You'll see." With that, she stepped out and the door slammed shut, locking behind her with the same series of heavy clicks. I was alone. I sat on the bed for a few minutes, trying to process what I had gotten myself into. There was no going back now, but something about the way she said strange occurrences left a knot in my stomach. I decided to inspect the room, get a feel for where I'd be spending the next month. Everything felt too perfect. The walls were a dull gray, no cracks, no imperfections. The bed was stiff, but functional. There was no clock, no sense of time in here. It was like I had been dropped into a place that wasn't quite real, some kind of controlled environment designed to mess with my head. And then I saw it, in the corner of the room, near the ceiling, where she'd pointed earlier, the camera. It was small, nearly invisible, but now that I knew it was there, I couldn't stop looking at it. It was watching me, always. I sat down on the bed, feeling the weight of its gaze. Was this really just some psychological test, or was it something more? The first day passed slowly. They brought me 3 meals, each delivered through a slot in the door. The food was bland, unremarkable, but I ate everything like they told me. The camera never moved, but I knew it was recording every bite. At night, when the lights dimmed, that's when things got worse. I started hearing noises. At first, it was just small creaks, like the house settling. But then, they grew louder, more deliberate. Footsteps, heavy, slow footsteps just outside my door. I got up and pressed my ear against it, but all I heard was the steady thump, thump, thump. I backed away from the door, my heart racing. I knew it was locked. They told me not to try and leave, but what was out there? Why were there footsteps if I was supposed to be alone? I barely slept that night. The noises continued, sometimes right outside my door, sometimes further down the hallway. Always moving, always there. When morning came, or what I assumed was morning, since there was no way to tell time, the footsteps stopped. My breakfast arrived through the slot, but the silence was even more unnerving. I ate in front of the camera, my mind racing with questions. What was this study really about? And more importantly, who or what was walking outside my door last night? The second night is when things really started to unravel. By then, I had settled into the routine, meals coming through the slot, the camera silently observing every move I made. I was growing used to the unsettling stillness of the room, but I hadn't gotten used to the feeling of being watched. Every time I moved, I could feel that tiny camera in the corner tracking me, even though it didn't move. It was unnerving, but manageable, at least during the day. But at night, things changed. Just like the first night, I heard the footsteps again. Slow, heavy, like someone pacing right outside my door. But this time, they didn't stop after a few hours. They continued well into what I assumed was morning. Every time I tried to fall asleep, the sound of those footsteps would jolt me awake, my heart pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just part of the study. They were probably playing some recording or having one of the staff members walk up and down the halls to freak me out. That's how these things work, right? Psychological manipulation. I kept telling myself that, trying to rationalize what was happening. But then came the knock. It was soft at first. So soft I thought I had imagined it. Just 3 taps, right on the other side of the steel door. I froze. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe stupidity, forced me to my feet. I walked slowly, cautiously, toward the door. Tap, tap, tap. This time, the knocking was louder, deliberate. I pressed my ear against the cold metal and held my breath, straining to hear anything on the other side. For a few moments, there was nothing but silence. And then, I heard it. A voice. Low, whispering, almost unintelligible. But I could make out a few words. Let me in. My blood ran cold. I pulled back from the door, trying to process what I had just heard. Who was out there? Dr. Quinn had told me that I wouldn't see anyone except the staff bringing my meals. This wasn't part of the agreement. Tap, tap, tap. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. The voice followed, still quiet but clearer now. Please, let me in. I backed away from the door, my pulse racing. There was no way I was opening it. Whatever was on the other side, it wasn't good. I looked up at the camera, hoping someone was watching, that they'd see what was happening and do something. But the camera didn't react. It just stared. The knocking stopped abruptly, and I let out a shaky breath. Maybe it was over. Maybe that was just part of the experiment. Some psychological trick to test my reaction. I tried to convince myself of that as I crawled back into bed, pulling the thin blanket up to my chest like a kid hiding from the monsters under the bed. But then the door handle rattled. It was subtle at first, just a slight, metallic jiggle. My eyes shot toward the door and I could see the handle moving, twisting slowly, like someone was trying to open it from the other side. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I knew the door was locked, but that didn't stop the overwhelming fear from taking hold. The handle continued to turn, the mechanism clicking softly. I bolted out of bed, pressing my back against the far wall. My mind was racing with possibilities. Was this part of the study, or was something else going on? Suddenly, the handle stopped moving, and there was a long, eerie silence. For a moment, I thought that maybe whatever it was had given up, but then I heard it, the sound of something heavy pressing against the door, a faint, ragged breathing. It was so close, like whoever or whatever was on the other side was leaning against the door, just inches away from me. Please. The voice was louder now, more desperate. Let me in. I just want to talk. I shook my head, even though they couldn't see me. No. I whispered under my breath, my voice trembling. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped. The rattling, the voice, the footsteps, all of it. Just gone. The silence was even more unsettling. I stood there, pressed against the wall, too afraid to move, straining my ears for any hint of what might come next. Minutes passed, maybe hours. It was hard to tell. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I slid down to the floor, my back still pressed against the wall, my eyes never leaving the door. I stayed like that, too scared to sleep, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The next morning, the usual breakfast was pushed through the slot, but something was different this time. On top of the tray was a folded piece of paper, a note. My hands were shaking as I unfolded it, dread pooling in my stomach. It was handwritten, in neat, precise letters. You didn't let him in. Good, but be careful. He will try again. I stared at the note, my mind spinning. Who left this? Was it part of the study, or had someone slipped it in without the others knowing? The idea of someone else, someone not part of the staff, being involved made my skin crawl. I tried to tell myself that it was all just a mind game, part of whatever twisted psychological experiment they were running here. But deep down, I wasn't so sure anymore. There was something off about this place, something I couldn't explain. And the worst part, I knew, without a doubt, that the voice would come back. And next time, it wouldn't take no for an answer. The next few days blurred together in a haze of silence and dread. I didn't know if it was really days, though. There was no clock, no sunlight, no way to tell the passage of time. All I had were the 3 meals that came through the slot and the oppressive quiet that filled the room in between. The note haunted me. He will try again. Who was he? And why was I being warned? None of it made sense, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Even in the absence of footsteps and knocking, I felt something. Like the air was charged with a presence, something watching me that wasn't just the camera. Then, on what I guessed was the 5th or 6th night, the lights went out. It wasn't gradual, like a flicker or a dimming. It was immediate. One moment, the fluorescent light overhead was buzzing, casting a cold, white glow over the room. The next, total darkness. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. I couldn't see my own hand in front of my face. The darkness was thick, like a physical thing pressing down on me. My first instinct was to call out, to demand someone tell me what was going on, but my throat closed up. I didn't want to make a sound. It felt like the darkness would swallow my voice, draw attention to me. Then I heard it, breathing. It wasn't mine. This breathing was low, slow, and ragged, like someone struggling to draw in air. It was coming from the corner of the room, right where the camera was. I froze, my blood running cold. I knew the room was locked. I knew no one else could be in here. But that sound, it was unmistakable. Someone or something was in the room with me. I forced myself to stay still, every muscle tensed, listening. The breathing grew louder, more strained, as if whoever it was moving closer. My mind raced. Was this the he from the note? Was this part of the study? Or had something gone horribly wrong? The sound was getting closer, inching toward the bed. I could hear the soft scuff of footsteps on the wooden floor, the subtle shift of fabric, like someone brushing past furniture. But it was so dark, so pitch black, that I couldn't see a thing. I pressed myself back against the wall, gripping the edge of the mattress. I didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to do something, but I was paralyzed by fear. Then I felt it. A presence. It was standing at the foot of my bed. I didn't hear it anymore, didn't see it, but I felt it. The air was different, heavier, like something was occupying the space just inches from me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and I bit my lip to keep from making a sound. It was close, too close. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, for what felt like hours. Whatever it was, it didn't move, didn't speak. It just stood there, like it was waiting for something. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the lights flickered back on, and the room was empty. There was no one there. The camera in the corner remained motionless, the door locked. Everything was exactly the way it had been before. but the presence, I could still feel it, lingering. I had felt it standing there, inches from me, staring. I jumped out of bed, my body shaking uncontrollably. My legs felt weak, but I managed to stand. I rushed to the door, pounding on it, shouting for anyone, to let me out. But no one came. No one responded. The door remained locked. I backed away, trying to regain some sense of control, trying to think rationally. I paced the room, running my fingers through my hair, muttering to myself. This had to be part of the study, right? They were messing with my head, seeing how I'd react. It was all psychological, some kind of elaborate game, but that didn't explain the note. That didn't explain the voice, the knocking, the thing that had stood at the foot of my bed. I glanced at the camera again. I had this overwhelming feeling that whatever was watching me wasn't just human. The camera was an excuse, something to keep me distracted, to make me feel observed. But whatever was behind this, whatever had been in the room with me, was something else. Something I couldn't explain. And then I noticed it. The door. The heavy reinforced door that had been locked every night. It was slightly ajar. My heart nearly stopped. How? How had it unlocked? I hadn't heard the clicking, hadn't heard anyone open it. But there it was, cracked open just enough for me to see a sliver of the dark hallway outside. I took a step toward it, then froze. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay put, to not open that door. But I couldn't help myself. Slowly, cautiously, I walked up to it, heart thudding in my chest. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pushed the door open. It creaked on its hinges, revealing the pitch-black corridor outside. There were no lights in the hallway, just the same oppressive darkness I had felt in my room. I hesitated, my pulse racing. Part of me wanted to slam the door shut and hide, but I had to know. I had to find out what was happening. I stepped into the hallway. The air was cold, much colder than in my room. The walls seemed to close in around me as I crept forward, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. My footsteps echoed in the silence, and every shadow seemed to shift, watching me. As I made my way down the corridor, I saw something ahead, a door, slightly open, with a faint glow coming from inside. I approached it slowly, my hands shaking. I peered through the crack in the door, and what I saw nearly made my heart stop. There, in the center of the room, was a figure, tall, gaunt, with its back turned to me. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its limbs were unnaturally long. It stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something, and then it turned. Its face, God, I can't even describe it. Hollow, sunken eyes, no mouth, just a blank, expressionless void where a face should have been. I stumbled back, my mind reeling. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The thing didn't move, didn't react to my presence. It just stared at me with those empty eyes. I bolted back down the hallway, slamming the door to my room behind me, locking it with trembling hands. My chest heaved as I collapsed onto the bed, heart pounding in my ears. I knew, without a doubt, that this wasn't part of any study. This was something far worse, something I didn't understand. And now, it knew I was here. I don't know how long I stayed locked in that room, heart pounding, staring at the door, waiting for it to move, waiting for it to come after me. Hours passed, maybe days. The meals still came, sliding through the slot like clockwork, but I barely touched them. My appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear that grew with every passing second. The figure I had seen in the hallway, I couldn't stop thinking about it. That blank face, those hollow eyes. It was burned into my mind. What was it? And more importantly, what did it want with me? I thought about the note again. He will try again. Was that him? That thing I saw in the hallway? If so, why hadn't it come after me when it had the chance? The lights flickered for the first time since that night. The familiar buzz of the overhead fluorescent light cut out momentarily, plunging the room into total darkness before sparking back to life. It was a warning. I knew it. The darkness was coming again. And this time, I didn't think I'd survive it. I needed answers. I needed to know why I was here, what this study really was. I knew I couldn't just sit in the room and wait for whatever horror lurked outside to come for me. So I did something I swore I wouldn't. I stood up, heart hammering, and walked towards the door. It was locked again. Somehow, after I had bolted back in from that hallway, the door had sealed itself. There was no way out. I banged on it, desperate, but no one responded. Not Dr. Quinn. Not the mysterious figure. Nothing but the empty, hollow echo of my own fists against the steel. And then the door. It opened. I hadn't unlocked it. I hadn't touched the keypad. But slowly, silently, it swung open, revealing the pitch-black hallway beyond. My heart raced, my legs trembling beneath me, but I couldn't just sit there anymore. I stepped through. The hallway was even darker this time, the air colder, but I forced myself forward, hugging the walls as I moved. The last time I had gone this way, I'd seen that thing, and I knew, deep down, that it was still here, somewhere in the shadows, watching. As I made my way deeper into the corridor, I heard something. A faint hum, barely audible. It wasn't footsteps or breathing. It was something mechanical. Following the sound, I came to another door, this one unmarked, but slightly ajar, just like the last. I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, sterile, like a control center. Screens lined the walls, each one showing a different angle of the building. There were cameras everywhere, hallways, rooms, even outside in the surrounding forest. But the one that caught my eye was the feed from my own room. There I was, sitting on the bed. Only, it wasn't me. I stood there, frozen, staring at the screen. The person on the bed, the one in my room, looked exactly like me. Same clothes, same movements. But I was standing here, outside the room. I blinked, and the figure on the screen did the same. My blood turned to ice. What the hell was this? Some kind of simulation? A clone? My mind raced, trying to piece together what I was seeing, but none of it made sense. And then the figure on the screen turned its head. It wasn't just staring blankly like before. It was looking right at me. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, heart slamming in my chest. The screens flickered, and for a brief second, I saw something else, something darker. On every screen, I saw him, the figure with the hollow eyes. He was there, in every feed, standing just out of frame, watching. And then he stepped closer. On each monitor, he moved in unison, getting closer and closer to the cameras. Closer to me. I backed away from the control room, slamming the door behind me. The hum of the machinery faded as I sprinted down the hall. I had no idea where I was going, only that I needed to get out. There had to be a way out. There had to be. The hallway stretched on forever, twisting and turning like some kind of nightmare labyrinth. My breathing was ragged, my legs barely holding me up. And then I saw it, the door. The same heavy steel door I had entered through when I first arrived. Only this time, it wasn't locked. I ran to it, yanking it open with trembling hands. Outside, the air hit me like a punch to the gut. Cold, biting, but real. I stumbled out into the night. The forest surrounded me, dark and quiet. but it didn't feel threatening. It felt like freedom. For a moment, I stood there, gasping for air, trying to calm the panic in my chest. I was out. I was finally out. But then I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from behind me. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was him. The figure with the hollow eyes. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, staring at me with that empty, soulless face. And then he stepped forward. I bolted, running blindly through the trees, branches slashing at my skin as I stumbled through the underbrush. I didn't care where I was going. Anywhere was better than back there. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out beneath me. I collapsed in the middle of the forest, my body trembling, my mind racing. The footsteps had stopped. The figure was gone. But I knew, deep down, that I wasn't safe. I'd never be safe. I don't know what they did to me in that place. I don't know if I'm even me anymore, but I haven't seen daylight since.